I'm Rachel, 28 years old, and I used to believe family meant unconditional love. Growing up, I thought every family was like the ones in movies where parents cherish each child equally, and siblings support each other through everything. I imagined my future wedding would be this beautiful celebration where my mom would cry happy tears, and my sister would stand beside me as my maid of honor. But sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones writing you out of the story entirely. What I discovered about my family would shatter everything I believed about love, loyalty, and the truth they had been hiding from me for 25 years. Before I tell you how I brought their worst nightmare to my sister's wedding, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and please hit that like button and subscribe. This story gets intense, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Looking back now, I can see the pattern started when we were children, but at the time, I thought it was normal. Beverly, my sister, who's 25, was always the golden child. She had this perfect blonde hair that caught sunlight like spun gold, and these bright blue eyes that seemed to sparkle whenever adults looked at her. I had brown hair and brown eyes, and somehow I always felt like I faded into the background whenever Beverly walked into a room. When Beverly was 8 and I was 11, she started taking piano lessons. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Mom would drive her to Mrs. Henderson's house for hour-long sessions. I remember sitting in the car during those lessons, watching through the window as Beverly's tiny fingers danced across the keys. I asked Mom if I could take art classes at the community center, since I loved drawing and painting. She told me art classes were expensive and maybe next year. Next year never came. Beverly's piano recitals were family events. Mom would buy her these elaborate dresses with layers of tulle and satin. Dad would bring his camera and take dozens of photos. Extended family members would drive from neighboring towns to watch Beverly perform. When I had art displayed in the school hallway during parent-teacher conferences, Mom would glance at my paintings and say they were nice, then spend the rest of the evening talking to Beverly's teachers about her academic achievements. The pattern continued through high school. Beverly made honor roll every semester, and each time there would be a celebration dinner at her favorite restaurant. I made honor roll too, but those achievements seemed to pass unnoticed. Beverly played varsity tennis, and Mom attended every single match, cheering from the sidelines with a folding chair and a cooler full of snacks. I joined the drama club and had leading roles in 2 school productions. Mom said she was too busy to attend the performances. When Beverly graduated high school, Mom spent weeks planning this elaborate graduation party. There were catered appetizers, professional decorations, and a guest list of 50 people. I was assigned to help serve food and clean up afterward. My own high school graduation 2 years later was acknowledged with a cake from the grocery store and immediate family only. The most painful memory was Beverly's 18th birthday. Mom and Dad took her to New York City for a weekend shopping trip. They stayed in a fancy hotel and went to Broadway shows. Beverly came home with bags full of designer clothes and stories about room service breakfast. When I turned 18, they took me to dinner at Applebee's and bought me a gift card to Target. Dad's role in all of this was passive but enabling. Harold never actively participated in the favoritism, but he never stopped it either. When I would try to talk to him about feeling left out, he would pat my shoulder and say something like, "You know your mother gets excited about Beverly's activities," or, "You're so independent, Rachel. You don't need as much attention." His silence felt like agreement. Every time Mom would dismiss my accomplishments or exclude me from family activities, Dad would just look uncomfortable and change the subject. I learned that his love came with conditions too. The condition that I stay quiet and not rock the boat. I developed coping mechanisms that probably weren't healthy, but felt necessary at the time. I threw myself into my art with obsessive dedication. While Beverly was at tennis practice or piano lessons, I would spend hours in my bedroom drawing portraits and landscapes. Art became my escape and my identity. I told myself I didn't need their approval because I had talent they couldn't understand. I also became fiercely independent. Probably too early. By age 14, I was doing my own laundry, making my own meals, and handling my own school paperwork. When other kids complained about their parents being too involved in their lives, I felt a weird mix of envy and pride. I was proud of my self-sufficiency, but I envied their parents' attention. The exclusion from Beverly's high school graduation party planning was the first time I really understood what was happening. Mom had spent 3 weeks organizing every detail with Beverly. They made lists together, sampled catering options, and designed invitations. I offered to help with decorations since I was good at artistic stuff. Mom looked at me like I had suggested something ridiculous and said, "Oh, honey, we've got it handled. But you can help serve the appetizers at the party." That night I cried harder than I had in years. Not because I wanted to plan a party, but because I realized I wasn't considered family in the same way Beverly was. I was the help. The engagement announcement happened on a Tuesday evening in March. I remember the date exactly because it was the same day I had gotten my first big freelance graphic design contract, and I was excited to share the news with my family. I had been working at a small marketing firm for 2 years since college, but this independent project felt like a real breakthrough in my career. I arrived at my parents' house 20 minutes late because I had stayed at the office to finish up some designs. When I walked into the dining room, Beverly was practically vibrating with excitement. She had this enormous smile on her face and kept looking at Kenneth, her boyfriend of 3 years, like he had just handed her the moon. "Rachel, perfect timing," Mom said, but her tone suggested my timing was actually terrible. "Beverly has news." Beverly stood up from her chair and extended her left hand. The diamond ring was impossible to miss. It caught the light from the chandelier and threw little rainbows across the wall. "Kenneth proposed," she announced, and her voice had this breathless quality like she could hardly believe it herself. Kenneth was exactly the kind of man my parents had always hoped Beverly would marry. He was a successful lawyer at a prestigious firm downtown, drove a BMW, and came from a family that owned 3 restaurants in the city. He was handsome in that clean-cut, country club way that made middle-aged women sigh and tell their daughters, "That's the kind of man you should find." Mom literally squealed. She jumped up from her chair and pulled Beverly into this dramatic hug, and then they both started crying happy tears. Dad shook Kenneth's hand and clapped him on the back like they were old drinking buddies. I stood there, holding my portfolio of design work, feeling like I had walked into someone else's celebration. "When's the wedding?" Dad asked, and Beverly launched into this detailed explanation about how they wanted a June ceremony and had already started looking at venues. Mom immediately shifted into planning mode, talking about guest lists and dress shopping and flowers. The conversation moved so fast I felt dizzy trying to follow it. "We want a big wedding," Beverly said, looking directly at Kenneth for confirmation. "Something elegant and traditional. Kenneth's family knows everyone in the city, and this is going to be such an important event for both our families." That word, important, hit me strangely. It seemed to carry weight beyond just describing a wedding. Mom was already pulling out her phone to make notes. "We'll need to book a venue soon if you want June. The good places fill up a year in advance. And we'll need to think about the wedding party. Who are you considering for bridesmaids?" Beverly started listing names. College roommates, sorority sisters, Kenneth's sister, a cousin from Mom's side. I waited for my name to come up. When Beverly finished her list without mentioning me, I felt my stomach drop. "What about me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light and casual. Beverly looked genuinely surprised, like the thought hadn't occurred to her. "Oh, Rachel, I was thinking you could do something artistic for the reception. Maybe design the programs or help with decorations. You're so talented with that stuff." I felt like I had been slapped. "I was hoping to be your maid of honor," I said quietly. The room went silent. Mom set down her phone and looked at me with this expression I couldn't quite read. It wasn't anger exactly, but it wasn't sympathy either. "Rachel," Mom said, and her voice had that tone she used when she was about to say something she considered reasonable but knew I wouldn't like. "This wedding isn't about you. Beverly has important people to include in her wedding party. These are relationships she's built over years, people who matter to her social circle, and Kenneth's family." The word important again. I was starting to understand that in my family's vocabulary, important meant valuable, and valuable meant not me. "I'm her sister," I said, and I hated how small my voice sounded. "Of course you are," Beverly said quickly, "and you'll be involved, just not as a bridesmaid. Those spots are for my closest friends." I had been Beverly's sister for 25 years, but apparently that didn't make me close. Over the following weeks, I tried to contribute to wedding planning in whatever way they would let me. I suggested color schemes based on my understanding of design principles. I offered to create custom invitations. I researched photographers and florists and venues. Every suggestion was politely dismissed. When I showed Mom some invitation designs I had mocked up, she looked at them for about 30 seconds and said, "These are lovely, honey, but Beverly and Kenneth want something more traditional. We've already decided to go with a stationery company that Kenneth's mother recommends." When I found a photographer whose work I thought was stunning and whose prices were reasonable, Mom explained that they had already booked someone from Kenneth's family's social circle. When I suggested a beautiful botanical garden for the ceremony location, Beverly wrinkled her nose and said gardens were too unpredictable with weather and bugs. The final blow came when we were discussing reception details. I had assumed I would have a +1 like any other adult family member. When I mentioned bringing my boyfriend Marcus, Mom and Beverly exchanged a look. Actually, Rachel, Mom said carefully, we're working with a pretty tight guest list. Every seat is accounted for, and we need those seats for Beverly's important guests. There was that word again. Important guests. Not family. Not people who loved Beverly. Important guests. But other people get plus ones, I pointed out. Other people are in different situations, Beverly said. The wedding party gets plus ones, obviously. And Kenneth's family has people they need to include for business reasons. We just don't have room for everyone to bring dates. I found out later that Beverly's college friends, who lived in other states and hadn't spoken to her in months, all got plus ones. Kenneth's co-workers who barely knew Beverly got plus ones. But her sister, who had been there for every heartbreak and celebration for 25 years, didn't rate a seat for her boyfriend. That night I called Marcus and told him I wouldn't be bringing him to the wedding. He was confused and a little hurt. It's your sister's wedding, he said. Of course I should be there with you. I didn't know how to explain that in my family I wasn't the kind of person who got to bring dates to important events. The discovery that would change everything happened 3 weeks before the wedding. Mom had asked me to help clean out the attic because they were having work done on the roof and needed to move some boxes. It was typical. Beverly was too busy with wedding planning and dress fittings, so the manual labor fell to me. I was moving a stack of old photo albums when I accidentally knocked over a cardboard box labeled Tax Documents 1999. Papers scattered across the attic floor, and as I was gathering them up, I saw my name on several official-looking documents. The first paper that caught my attention was a birth certificate, but not the one I had seen before. This one listed different parents, people named Thomas and Linda Morrison. Below my name, in small print, it said adopted, and gave a date when I was 3 years old. My hands started shaking. I sat down on the dusty attic floor and stared at the document, reading it over and over. Rachel Morrison, adopted by Harold and Margaret Stevens when she was 3 years old after the death of her biological parents. I had never been told I was adopted. Not once in 25 years had anyone mentioned that Harold and Margaret weren't my biological parents. Every family story, every medical history form, every conversation about genetics and inherited traits had been built on a lie. But the adoption papers were just the beginning. Underneath them were legal documents about something called a settlement trust. I read through pages of lawyer language that made my head spin, but certain phrases jumped out. Wrongful death lawsuit, insurance settlement, trust fund for minor child, educational expenses and living costs. The numbers were staggering. My biological parents had died in a car accident caused by a drunk driver, and their life insurance combined with the legal settlement had created a trust fund worth over $400,000. The money was supposed to be used for my care and education, with the remainder becoming mine when I turned 18. I found bank statements showing regular withdrawals from the trust account. $15,000 for educational expenses the year Beverly started private school. $20,000 for living expenses the year they bought Beverly a car. $30,000 for childcare costs the year they paid for Beverly's college tuition. My inheritance, the money my biological parents had worked their entire lives to leave for me, had been systematically stolen to pay for Beverly's privileged life. I sat in that attic for 2 hours, reading through document after document. There were letters from lawyers warning my adoptive parents about improper use of trust funds. There were bank statements showing the account balance dropping year after year. There were receipts for Beverly's piano lessons, tennis lessons, and designer clothes, all paid for with money that was legally mine. The most devastating discovery was a folder labeled Trust Fund, Rachel's College. Inside were statements showing that by the time I graduated high school, my inheritance was almost gone. There had been enough money to send me to any college in the country, but instead I had taken out student loans while Beverly went to private university debt-free. I found correspondence between my adoptive parents and the bank that managed the trust. The bank had questioned several large withdrawals, particularly ones that didn't seem related to my direct care. My adoptive parents had provided explanations that were technically legal but morally bankrupt. Beverly's private school tuition was justified as, quote, providing a stable home environment for the minor child. Her college expenses were listed as family living costs that benefit the household, including the minor. The final piece of evidence was the most heartbreaking. In a manila envelope, I found letters from my biological family, aunts, uncles, and grandparents who had tried to contact me over the years. The letters were addressed to me but had never been delivered. They talked about wanting to know me, to share stories about my biological parents, to be part of my life. One letter from my biological Aunt Geraldine was dated just 6 months earlier. She had found my adoptive parents' address and written to ask if she could meet me. She wanted to tell me about my biological parents, show me photos, and give me family heirlooms that had been saved for me. The letter was warm and loving, and full of genuine desire to connect. There was a response letter from my adoptive mother that I was never meant to see. It was cold and dismissive, telling Geraldine that I was busy building my own life and wasn't interested in dwelling on the past. It instructed her not to contact the family again. My adoptive parents hadn't just stolen my money. They had stolen my biological family, my history, and my right to know where I came from. I photocopied every document before putting the box back exactly where I found it. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to process 25 years of lies. Everything made sense now, why I never felt like I truly belonged, why I looked nothing like the rest of the family, why my parents had always seemed more invested in Beverly's success than mine. I hadn't been their daughter. I had been their meal ticket. The next morning I called in sick to work and spent the day researching everything I could about trust funds, adoption law, and my biological family. I found Geraldine's phone number and sat staring at it for an hour before I had the courage to call. When she answered, her voice was exactly like I had imagined from her letter, warm and kind with a slight southern accent. "Geraldine Morrison," she said. "This is Rachel," I said, and my voice cracked. "Rachel Morrison, I think you're my aunt." The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought she had hung up. Then I heard her crying. "Oh, honey," she said. "Oh, my sweet girl. I have been waiting so long to hear your voice." The 6 weeks between finding the documents and Beverly's wedding were the longest of my life. Every family interaction felt like a performance where I was the only one who knew the script was fake. When Mom talked about wedding expenses and how much everything cost, I wanted to scream that she was spending money that had never belonged to her. When Beverly complained about student loan payments from graduate school, I bit my tongue to keep from mentioning that my stolen inheritance had paid for her undergraduate degree. The wedding planning continued at a frantic pace, and my role in it became even more diminished. Beverly had decided she wanted a destination bachelor party weekend in Napa Valley with her bridesmaids. The cost per person was $800, which Beverly mentioned casually like it was pocket change. When I didn't immediately respond with enthusiasm, Mom explained that the trip was just for the wedding party, and I wouldn't be expected to attend. I wasn't expected to attend my own sister's bachelorette party. Instead, I was assigned increasingly menial tasks. I spent an entire Saturday addressing invitations by hand because Beverly wanted a personal touch. I drove to 3 different craft stores, looking for the exact shade of ribbon Mom had decided was essential for centerpieces. I assembled 200 wedding favors while listening to Beverly and her bridesmaids plan their weekend trip. The dress shopping expedition was particularly humiliating. Beverly, Mom, and the bridesmaids made a day of it at an expensive bridal boutique downtown. They served champagne and had a personal consultant help Beverly try on dress after dress. I was invited to attend, but only as an observer. When I suggested a dress that I thought was beautiful, the consultant dismissed it as not quite the right style for this type of wedding. When it came time to discuss what I would wear, the conversation was brief and decisive. Mom told me I should wear something simple in black or navy that wouldn't draw attention away from the wedding party. When I mentioned that I had been hoping to wear a dress in the wedding colors, Beverly looked genuinely confused. "The wedding colors are for the wedding party," she said, like I was asking to wear her wedding dress. "Guests wear neutral colors." I was a guest at my sister's wedding. Not family. A guest. The venue walkthrough was the final straw. Beverly, Kenneth, Mom, Dad, and the wedding planner spent an afternoon at the country club, going over every detail of the ceremony and reception. I found out about it when Beverly posted photos on social media showing the group pointing at flower arrangements and testing the sound system. When I asked why I wasn't included, Mom said my input wasn't needed, since I wasn't involved in the planning decisions. The fact that no one had asked for my input didn't seem to register as a problem. That night, I called Geraldine and told her everything about the wedding situation. She listened quietly while I described months of exclusion and dismissal. "Honey," she said when I finished, "I think it's time your family learned some hard truths." We spent the next week planning. Geraldine lived 4 hours away, but she was willing to make the trip. I sent her copies of all the financial documents I had found, and she consulted with a lawyer friend about the legal implications. The theft of my inheritance was documented clearly enough to pursue criminal charges if I chose to. More importantly, Geraldine brought me photos and stories about my biological parents that helped me understand who I really was. My biological mother had been an artist like me. My biological father had been quiet and thoughtful, preferring books to parties. They had been deeply in love and excited about raising me. Their death had been sudden and tragic, but they had made sure I would be provided for. The week before the wedding, Beverly asked me to work the guest book table during the reception. Not as a guest who would sign the book, but as an employee who would encourage other guests to sign it and keep the area organized. "It's perfect for you," she said brightly. "You're so good with people, and it's an important job." I agreed to work the guest book table, but I also made another plan. The night before the wedding, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the moments over the years when I had felt like something was wrong but couldn't put my finger on what it was. The birthday parties where I felt like an outsider. The family photos where I never quite seemed to fit. The conversations that stopped when I walked into rooms. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, the truth would finally come out. The morning of Beverly's wedding was chaos in the way that only wedding mornings can be. I arrived at my parents' house at 7 a.m., as instructed to help with last-minute preparations. The house buzzed with activity. Flower deliveries, makeup artists setting up stations, bridesmaids arriving with garment bags and excited chatter. I spent the morning doing exactly what I had been doing for months, the invisible work that nobody noticed until it wasn't done. I ironed tablecloths, assembled centerpieces, and loaded cars with supplies that needed to be transported to the country club. Beverly and her bridesmaids were ensconced in the master bedroom, with professional hair and makeup teams, occasionally emerging to ask if their mimosas needed refreshing. Around noon, I excused myself to get ready at my hotel room downtown. I had booked my own accommodations since there was no room for me at the house where the wedding party was preparing. As I drove away from the chaos, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. At the hotel, I showered and put on the simple black dress Mom had deemed appropriate for me. It was actually quite lovely, fitted and elegant, but I knew it had been chosen to make me invisible rather than to make me feel beautiful. I did my own hair and makeup, something I had gotten good at over years of not being included in professional preparations. At 2:30, I walked into the country club lobby and saw Geraldine immediately. She was exactly as I had imagined from our phone conversations, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and silver hair, wearing a sophisticated navy dress. She was holding a leather portfolio and looking around the lobby with obvious nervousness. "Aunt Geraldine," I said, and she turned toward my voice with a smile that lit up her entire face. "Rachel," she said, and pulled me into a hug that felt like coming home. "You look just like your mother." We had talked extensively about what would happen today, but seeing her in person made it feel real, in a way that phone conversations hadn't. She was my biological family, my connection to parents I had never known, and proof that I hadn't been alone in the world before my adoption. We walked into the main reception area, where guests were gathering for the ceremony. The country club was decorated exactly as Beverly had envisioned: white flowers, crystal chandeliers, and enough elegance to satisfy Kenneth's family's social expectations. I spotted Mom and Dad near the front of the room, greeting guests and accepting congratulations. When Mom saw Geraldine walking beside me, her face went completely white. She excused herself from the conversation she was having and walked quickly toward us, her expression shifting from confusion to recognition to panic. "Rachel," she said, and her voice was tight with false brightness. "I didn't know you were bringing a guest." "This is my Aunt Geraldine," I said clearly, "my biological aunt. She wanted to be here for this important family event." Dad appeared beside Mom, and I watched the same sequence of emotions cross his face. Recognition, fear, and desperate calculation about how to handle an unexpected crisis. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Dad said quietly. "Perhaps we could discuss this privately." "There's no misunderstanding," Geraldine said, and her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent years wanting this moment. "I'm here as Rachel's family, the family you've kept her from knowing for 22 years. Mom looked around frantically, clearly hoping no other guests had overheard. "This isn't the appropriate time or place," she hissed. "Really?" Geraldine said with perfect composure. "When would be the appropriate time to meet my niece? You've been ignoring my letters for years." The ceremony was scheduled to start in 15 minutes, and guests were beginning to take their seats. Mom and Dad were trapped between wanting to remove Geraldine and not wanting to create a scene before Beverly's big moment. We'll discuss this after the ceremony, Mom said firmly, then walked away to signal that the conversation was over. Geraldine and I found seats in the back of the ceremony space. I had been assigned to sit with extended family and family friends, while the front rows were reserved for immediate family and the wedding party. The irony wasn't lost on me that my biological aunt and I were sitting together in the section for people who weren't quite important enough to be up front. The ceremony began with all the traditional pomp Beverly had wanted. Kenneth's groomsmen walked down the aisle in perfectly tailored tuxedos. Beverly's bridesmaids followed in flowing lavender dresses, carrying bouquets of white roses. Finally, Beverly herself appeared on Dad's arm, looking absolutely radiant in a dress that had cost more than some people's cars. The ceremony proceeded exactly as rehearsed. Kenneth and Beverly exchanged vows they had written themselves, full of promises about partnership and devotion and building a life together. Dad walked Beverly down the aisle with obvious pride, his chest puffed out as he delivered his daughter to her new husband. I found myself thinking about how this moment was being paid for with money that had belonged to me. The flowers, the venue, Beverly's dress, the catered reception, all of it funded by the inheritance my biological parents had left to ensure I would have opportunities and security. When the minister reached the part about speaking now or forever holding your peace, I felt Geraldine shift beside me. We had discussed this moment extensively, but I still felt my heart racing as she slowly stood up. I have something to say, she announced clearly. The entire room turned to look at her. Beverly's face went from radiant bride to confused panic in about 2 seconds. Kenneth looked bewildered. Mom and Dad both looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. I'm sorry to interrupt this beautiful ceremony, Geraldine continued. But there are some truths that need to be shared before this family celebrates new beginnings. Ma'am, the minister said gently, this portion of the ceremony is traditionally for objections to the marriage itself. Oh, I'm not objecting to the marriage, Geraldine said with a slight smile. I'm objecting to the lies this family has been built on. She opened her leather portfolio and pulled out a stack of documents. My name is Geraldine Morrison, and I'm Rachel's biological aunt. Rachel's biological parents died when she was 3 years old, leaving her a substantial inheritance that was supposed to provide for her education and future. The room was completely silent, except for the sound of papers rustling as Geraldine held up bank statements and legal documents. For 22 years, Rachel's adoptive parents have systematically stolen that inheritance to pay for their biological daughter's privileged lifestyle. Private school, college tuition, cars, vacations, all paid for with money that legally belonged to Rachel. Beverly made a sound like she was choking. Kenneth reached for her hand, but she pulled away from him, staring at Geraldine like she was speaking a foreign language. Furthermore, Geraldine continued, they have deliberately kept Rachel from knowing her biological family, intercepting letters and blocking attempts at contact. They stole not just her money but her identity and her connections to her real family. Mom finally found her voice. This is completely inappropriate, she said loudly. Security should remove this woman immediately. But the country club staff seemed as stunned as everyone else. Several guests had started taking out their phones, and I realized this moment was being recorded and would probably be online within hours. I have documentation of every theft, Geraldine said, raising her voice slightly. Bank records, forged signatures, misappropriated funds. 22 years of criminal activity that funded the lifestyle everyone is celebrating today. Kenneth stepped forward, and for the first time since I had known him, he looked genuinely shaken. Beverly, he said quietly, is this true? Beverly turned to look at Mom and Dad, clearly hoping they would deny everything and make this nightmare go away. But their faces told the story better than any confession could have. We saved her from foster care, Mom said desperately. We gave her a loving home and a family. We deserve some compensation for that sacrifice. You deserved compensation, I said, standing up and speaking for the first time. For loving a child. The words hung in the air like a slap. Around the room, wedding guests were murmuring to each other, trying to process what they were witnessing. Everything you gave Beverly was bought with my money, I continued, and I was surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Her private school education, her college tuition, her car, her study abroad program in Italy, her graduate school expenses. All of it came from the inheritance my real parents left for me. Beverly was crying now, but they weren't the happy tears of a bride. They were the desperate tears of someone watching their entire life get redefined in real time. I didn't know, she said, looking directly at me. Rachel, I swear I didn't know. But you never questioned why you got everything and I got nothing, I replied. You never wondered why you went to private school while I went to public school. You never asked why you got a car for your 16th birthday while I worked at a grocery store to buy my own. You never thought it was strange that you went to college debt-free while I took out loans. Kenneth was backing away from Beverly now, and I could see the calculation happening in his face. His family's social standing, his law firm's reputation, his political aspirations. All of it was incompatible with being married to someone whose family had committed financial crimes. Kenneth, Beverly said desperately, reaching for him, please, we can work this out. But Kenneth was already shaking his head. I can't, he said quietly. My family, my career, I can't be associated with this. The ceremony space had erupted into chaos. Guests were talking loudly, many of them pulling out phones to call other people who needed to hear this news immediately. Wedding vendors stood around looking confused about whether they should continue with their jobs or pack up and leave. Dad made one last attempt at damage control. Everyone please remain calm, he announced. This is a family matter that we'll resolve privately. Actually, Geraldine said, pulling out her phone, this is a legal matter that we'll be resolving publicly. I've already been in contact with attorneys about pursuing criminal charges for theft and fraud. That was when Beverly completely broke down. She collapsed into one of the ceremony chairs, still wearing her $4,000 wedding dress, and sobbed like her heart was breaking. Which, I suppose, it was. Kenneth removed his boutonniere and placed it on the altar, then walked out of the country club without another word. Several of his family members followed him, their expressions making it clear that the social alliance between the two families was permanently severed. The wedding was over before it had officially begun. The aftermath of what would become known as the wedding day revelation unfolded over several hours, but the social destruction was immediate and comprehensive. Within 30 minutes of Kenneth walking out, most of the wedding guests had left. The few who remained were family members and close friends who seemed torn between loyalty and shock. Beverly spent the first hour alternating between rage and devastation. She screamed at me for ruining her wedding, then collapsed in tears when the reality of her situation became clear. Her dress was wrinkled and stained with makeup, her carefully arranged hair was falling out of its pins, and her dream wedding had become a public nightmare. My life is over, she kept saying. My entire life is over. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness watching her fall apart. Part of me was glad she was finally experiencing consequences for a lifetime of privilege built on my stolen inheritance. But part of me genuinely felt sorry for her, because she really hadn't known the truth about where her advantages had come from. Mom and Dad's response was to immediately go into crisis management mode. Dad started making phone calls to people I assumed were lawyers, while Mom tried to convince the remaining family members that Geraldine was lying or confused about the financial details. But the documentation was too clear and too extensive for anyone to dismiss. Kenneth's departure had been swift and final. His best man stayed long enough to collect the groomsmen's gifts and explain that Kenneth would be in touch about returning Beverly's engagement ring. The message was clear. There would be no reconciliation, no working through this crisis together, no standing by Beverly during difficult times. The wedding vendors were in an impossible position. The photographer had been capturing what he thought was a celebration, and ended up documenting a family's destruction. The caterers had prepared a 5-course dinner for 150 guests, most of whom had left before appetizers were served. The band had learned Beverly and Kenneth's special songs for their first dance, but there would be no dancing tonight. Mom tried to salvage something from the day by suggesting we continue with the reception for the remaining family members, but Beverly was in no condition to pretend everything was fine. She had locked herself in the bridal suite and refused to come out. The country club manager, clearly experienced with wedding disasters, quietly began coordinating the breakdown of decorations and the packing up of unused food. He handled everything with professional discretion, but I could see him calculating the cost of the disaster and probably wondering who was responsible for payment. Around 6 p.m., when the reception should have been in full swing, Harold finally approached me directly. I was sitting in the lobby with Geraldine, both of us emotionally drained from the day's events. "Rachel," he said, and his voice sounded older than I had ever heard it. "Can we talk privately?" I looked at Geraldine, who nodded encouragingly. "I'll be right here," she said. Dad and I walked out to the country club's garden, where, ironically, Beverly and Kenneth should have been taking their formal wedding photos. The late afternoon light was beautiful, soft and golden, the kind of light that makes everything look romantic and perfect. "I know you're angry," Dad said, and for the first time in my life he sounded genuinely broken. "And you have every right to be angry. What we did was wrong. It was the closest to an apology I had ever heard from him, but it felt too little and too late. You stole my entire inheritance, I said. You kept me from my biological family. You made me feel like I was crazy for thinking I didn't belong. We thought we were doing what was best, he said weakly. When we adopted you, we honestly believed we were saving you from a terrible situation. And when the money came, it felt like compensation for taking on that responsibility. Taking on that responsibility, I repeated. You mean raising a child? He winced at my tone. It wasn't supposed to be permanent, he said quietly. We thought we would use some of the money to get established, to buy a house and get Beverly settled, and then put the rest away for your future. But things kept coming up. Beverly's school expenses, medical bills, home repairs. Before we knew it, the money was gone. The money was gone to pay for Beverly's privileged lifestyle, I corrected. Private school, tennis lessons, college tuition, study abroad, graduate school. None of that was emergency expenses. He nodded slowly. You're right. We justified it to ourselves, but you're right. And what about my biological family? What about Aunt Geraldine's letters? That seemed to hurt him more than the financial accusations. Your mother thought it would be confusing for you, he said. She thought you were better off not knowing about your biological family, not having divided loyalties. That wasn't her choice to make, I said, and I was surprised by how angry I still felt. Those people loved me. They wanted to know me. You stole that from me, just like you stole everything else. We stood in silence for a few minutes, both of us staring at the manicured gardens that should have been the backdrop for celebration photos. What happens now? He asked finally. Now you face the consequences, I said. Geraldine has already consulted with lawyers. The theft is well documented. You'll probably face criminal charges. His face went gray. And Beverly? I thought about my sister, probably still locked in the bridal suite, her entire life plan destroyed in a single afternoon. Beverly will have to figure out how to build a life that isn't funded by stolen money. Just like I did. That evening, news of the wedding disaster spread through our social circle with the speed that only true scandal can achieve. Social media posts about the interrupted ceremony were shared and reshared. Kenneth's hasty departure became the subject of speculation and gossip. Beverly's engagement photos, which had been featured in the society pages just months earlier, now looked like evidence in a crime story. The professional consequences for Dad began almost immediately. Several of his business clients called that evening to distance themselves from the family. Kenneth's father, who had referred significant legal work to Dad's accounting firm, sent a formal letter terminating their business relationship. Beverly's social circle reacted with a mixture of shock and fascination. Some of her friends rallied around her, insisting that she was as much a victim as I was. Others distanced themselves quickly, not wanting to be associated with a family scandal. The junior league dropped her from consideration for an upcoming leadership position. Her graduate school classmates, who had been planning to attend her wedding, now had front-row seats to her public humiliation. Mom's response was the most predictable, complete denial and blame-shifting. She spent the evening calling relatives and family friends, trying to control the narrative by portraying me as an ungrateful adopted child, who was destroying the family out of jealousy and spite. But the documentation was too clear for anyone to believe her version of events. Bank records don't lie. Legal documents don't have ulterior motives. The evidence spoke for itself. The weeks following the wedding disaster were a whirlwind of legal consultations, media attention, and emotional processing that I never could have prepared for. Geraldine had connected me with an attorney who specialized in financial crimes, and the legal case was stronger than even I had hoped. The theft of my inheritance was documented so clearly that criminal charges were almost inevitable. The bank records showed systematic withdrawals that violated the terms of the trust fund. The forged signatures on authorization forms were obvious when compared to my actual signature. Most damning of all, my adoptive parents had continued taking money even after I turned 18, when the remaining funds should have been turned over to me directly. The attorney estimated that between the principal theft and 20 years of lost investment growth, my adoptive parents owed me nearly $800,000. The house they lived in, purchased with money from my trust fund, would likely have to be sold. Dad's business assets might be seized to satisfy the judgment. But the money, while important, wasn't the most significant part of my healing process. The most valuable thing was the relationship I was building with my biological family. Geraldine had brought photo albums and family stories that filled in 25 years of missing history. I learned that my biological mother, Linda, had been a watercolor artist who sold her paintings at local art fairs. My biological father, Thomas, had been a high school English teacher who wrote poetry in his spare time. They had been deeply in love, devoted parents, and excited about giving me siblings when the accident happened. I had biological grandparents who had died wishing they could have known me. I had cousins my age who had grown up hearing stories about their missing cousin, Rachel. I had an entire family history of creativity, education, and quiet strength that explained so much about who I was and where my talents had come from. Connecting with this family felt like putting on clothes that actually fit after wearing hand-me-downs for 25 years. These people understood my artistic sensibilities, my love of books, my preference for deep conversations over small talk. They welcomed me not as a charity case or a project, but as someone they had been missing for decades. The legal settlement took 6 months to finalize, but when it was completed, I found myself in a financial position I had never imagined. After attorney fees and taxes, I received nearly $600,000, money that gave me options I had never had before. I used part of the settlement to pay off my student loans, which felt symbolically important since my education had been funded by debt, while Beverly's was funded by my stolen inheritance. I also bought a small house in a neighborhood I loved, something I had never imagined being able to afford on my graphic design salary. But the most satisfying use of the money was starting my own design firm. I had always dreamed of being my own boss, taking on projects I was passionate about, and building something that was entirely mine. The settlement money gave me the freedom to turn down corporate clients I didn't like, and focus on working with nonprofits, artists, and small businesses that were doing meaningful work. My relationship with Beverly slowly began to heal, though it required her to face some difficult truths about privilege and complicity. She had to accept that while she might not have known where her advantages came from, she had benefited enormously from my stolen inheritance. She also had to acknowledge that she had participated in my exclusion and marginalization, even if she hadn't understood the full context. Beverly's life after the wedding disaster was genuinely difficult, and I tried to take no pleasure in her struggles. Kenneth never contacted her again, and their mutual social circle largely sided with him and his family. She had to move back in with our parents, who were facing their own financial and legal problems. She had to find a job that could cover her graduate school loan payments, something she had never had to worry about before. But Beverly was resilient in ways I hadn't expected. She started therapy to process her own trauma around the family dynamics she was raised in. She began to understand how the favoritism that had benefited her had also harmed her by making her entitled and dependent. She worked hard to rebuild her life on a foundation of honesty and self-reliance. Our parents' response was less encouraging. Dad eventually acknowledged the wrongness of their actions and cooperated fully with the legal process. But Mom never stopped believing that they had been justified in their choices. She maintained that adopting me had been a sacrifice that deserved compensation, and that keeping me from my biological family had been protective rather than harmful. The criminal charges resulted in probation and community service rather than jail time, partly because of their age and Dad's cooperation with returning assets. But the social and financial consequences were severe. They lost their house, their social standing, and most of their friends. Dad's business never recovered from the scandal. I struggled with guilt about their downfall, even though I knew intellectually that they had brought it on themselves. It's one thing to want justice, and another thing to watch elderly people lose everything they had built over a lifetime of poor choices. But Geraldine helped me understand that accountability was necessary for healing, both mine and theirs. "Honey," she told me one afternoon over coffee, "you didn't destroy your family. You revealed the destruction that was already there. The lies were going to catch up with them eventually. At least this way, everyone can start building something real." The therapy I started after the settlement helped me process 25 years of gaslighting, emotional neglect, and identity confusion. I had to learn to trust my own perceptions and feelings after decades of being told they were wrong. I had to grieve the family I thought I had, while learning to embrace the family I had discovered. Most importantly, I had to forgive myself for not speaking up sooner, for accepting treatment I knew was wrong, for believing I deserved less than other people. The little girl who had been told she was lucky to be rescued from foster care had grown into a woman who understood she had always deserved love without conditions. My relationship with Marcus, my boyfriend who had been excluded from the wedding, deepened as he supported me through the legal process and family drama. He was patient with my trust issues and celebrated every step of my healing journey. A year after the settlement, he proposed with a ring he had saved for months to buy, and I said yes to a partnership built on honesty and mutual respect. Planning my own wedding was a completely different experience from watching Beverly's. I included people who genuinely loved and supported me. I made decisions based on what would make Marcus and me happy, rather than what would impress other people. My biological family played important roles in the ceremony, and the celebration felt authentic in a way I had never experienced before. As I write this story 2 years later, I can honestly say that the worst day of Beverly's life became one of the most important days of mine. Not because I enjoyed her pain, but because it marked the beginning of my freedom from a family system that had never valued me as I deserved to be valued. I learned that sometimes the people who say they love you are the ones stealing from your future. Real family doesn't require you to be grateful for basic human decency. And sometimes, bringing the truth to light is the only way to set yourself free. The wedding they thought was Beverly's perfect day became the day I finally reclaimed my life. If you're listening to this and feeling like the forgotten child in your family, remember that your worth isn't determined by how others treat you. Sometimes the biggest gift you can give yourself is the courage to speak your truth, even when it destroys the lies others built their lives on. Speaking your truth might cost you the family you thought you had, but it might also give you the family you actually deserve. For me, losing my adoptive family's approval was painful, but finding my biological family's love was life-changing. The inheritance they stole from me was significant, but the identity and connections they stole were priceless. You don't have to be grateful for mistreatment just because it comes from people who are supposed to love you. You don't have to accept less than you deserve just to keep the peace. And you don't have to carry other people's shame about choices they made. The truth will always find a way to surface. The only question is whether you'll be the one to bring it to light, or whether you'll wait for someone else to expose what you already know in your heart. I chose to speak my truth at my sister's wedding because that was the moment when the contrast between their lies and reality was impossible to ignore. But your moment might be different. The important thing is recognizing when that moment comes and having the courage to act on it. Your story matters. Your voice matters. And you deserve a family that celebrates who you are rather than trying to erase you from the narrative they're writing about themselves. What about you? Have you ever felt erased from your family's story? Have you discovered secrets that changed how you understood your childhood? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments below. Please like this video if my story resonated with you, and subscribe for more real stories about family, truth, and finding the courage to reclaim your life. Share this with someone who might need to hear that they're not alone in feeling like the forgotten child. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that your truth is worth telling, no matter how much it might shake up the world around you.